Chapter 5. Failing. The day that followed was blue and beautiful and mute. Clouds of impossible whiteness, sheer-edged against the sky, both high and eyeless, sailed heaven. They saw nothing, they were. They said nothing, knew nothing, cared nothing. They floated, and they were. It was enough to make one weep. And the trees revealed a wide variety of emotion. Umber, the burnt brown, brooded. The lady oak took red at the edges, a deep flame red, while yet she kept green at her heart, and so she seemed a gentlewoman of a long experience. Some of the maples burst yellow, effulgent, crying attention, demanding attention. Some of the maples slurred a bright primary red, an almost unnatural red, upon themselves, like harlots laughing. Some of the maples shed their leaves in the first draught and stood naked. Aspens were modest, giggling trees, but where they were so many. They could afford to be modest. Pine and fir thrust green among the color, unchanging, unwilling to change, criticizing by their contrast every other change. And the elm and the walnut, the willow, the gum, and the locust, the woods, the busy woods, the heartless forest and the trees, that whole congregation simply went about its natural business. And where was the one among them who stopped and groaned? Who stopped and acknowledged that things were not the same? How could the leaves turn now? How could the season turn, the world so mindlessly turn, while Russell lay sick on the ground? Chanticleer the rooster strutted around Russell's maple in a speechless fury. This was the most splendid day of the autumn, but the beauty had no right to be, not now, and if it persisted none the less, then it proved itself heartless, blind, coldly cruel, deserving the spite of a rooster. This day smelled clean, and it nipped one's toes. It carried the breezes of harvest, the crackle of cornstalks, the promise of a distant snow. It asked vigor of the living creatures, high blood, food, and laughter. It was enough to make one weep. Not a hen took pleasure in that day, nor any of the mice. Even John Wesley Weasel maintained solemnity, for Chanticleer could not stop pacing. He threw himself left and right, his anger hissing in his nostrils, an eye turned grimly on the whole brutish world, an eye for Russell the fox. Russell the fox. No motion now, no color in him, no vigor, no promise, no effort, no good. He lay beneath his maple, a bright yellow one, with his riven snout on crossed paws, his jaws separated as though held around a vowel, his eyes perfectly flat. Bertolotte had swathed his mouth in a bandage of cobwebs. He hadn't argued. He hadn't cared. Yellow leaves fell on Russell. Chanticleer saw that and fanned his wing at them, and yanked back his head as if to say, "See!" Supreme contempt, plain fury. In fact, he said nothing, but paced more viciously. Then Russell moved, and Chanticleer froze, watching. A contraction, a slow wave, passed up his back, from his loins to his neck. He half rose. He put his face down and shook. It looked as though he were caught in long, inconsolable sobs, as though the full understanding of his grief had finally possessed him. Chanticleer took one step away from the fox, then one step toward him. The spasms continued more sharply until they forced a noise out of Russell. Not sobbing, not crying, but a ratchet of gas, air coming with such violence that it sounded like gunshots. Then Russell vomited a stream of vile liquid, and then he lay down again, and his face was in the vomit. Chanticleer exploded. "Oh, Russell, can't you try to help yourself? Who's going to care if you don't care for yourself?" The rooster had pitched himself forward toward the fox. To do what? To hit him? The better to scream at him? When Russell raised his brow and rolled his eyes to Chanticleer and looked at him, He gave his friend one glance of inexpressible sadness, as if to say, "Don't you know?" And then he gazed again into infinity, and that was all. But that glance broke the heart of the rooster. "No, no, oh no," pleaded Chanticleer. I don't mean you any more pain than you have, Russell. No, no, I'm sorry. Ah, my friend, I am so sorry." All of the rage of the rooster melted away, leaving humility only, a painfully humble Chanticleer. So it was Chanticleer himself who put his neck below the fox's chin and lifted him from the vomit. And it was Chanticleer who wiped the fox face clean of its filth. Slow strokes, merciful strokes, loving, penitential strokes, and licking where that was necessary. Chanticleer kept the fox's bed thereafter, with leaves soft and warm and deep. Chanticleer nursed him more tenderly than a hen might, and Chanticleer never left him, neither in the day nor in the night time. And the rooster never, never lifted his voice again against the fox, but always crooned and muttered kindness and pleaded forgiveness, constantly prayed poor Russell's forgiveness. But Russell spoke no more. So that is the way that it went. When Russell would not eat, Chanticleer suffered and fed him. He whispered loving words to him, but among those words he apologized for Russell's lack of appetite, for having to push fermented apples into his mouth, for manipulating Russell's jaw in a mimic of chewing, for everything, for the humiliation of having to be fed. But the fox didn't speak. The fox did not so much as turn his eyes toward Chanticleer, so the rooster's heart grew full to overflowing, and his pain found no relief. When the fox discharged a thin, hot liquid from his bowels, Chanticleer was almost grateful. The more loathsome the task, the more shriven the rooster. He sought slavery. He wanted no help from a single hen. He wanted not to sleep. He grew somewhat feverish himself, but Russell grew no better. The fox's mouth simply surrendered to infection. It didn't even swell this time. Ulcers opened and ran constantly, and the flesh around them corrupted, died and fell away, and the gums softened. The stink was unendurable. Yet Chanticleer came near with food, and still he moved the jaws into a chewing motion. As Russell declined, Chanticleer's help took a certain desperation, and his happy words became more hectic, his apologies more miserable, his gestures almost antic. He jerked the jaws together. But Russell wasn't talking anymore. Russell was communicating absolutely nothing, not even pain. Therefore the rooster could not know until they actually fell out onto the ground that he had been breaking Russell's teeth from their sockets, and some of these the fox must have swallowed, but here were 3 that dropped between the fox and the rooster. Teeth. "Ah, Russell!" wailed poor Chanticleer. "Russell, forgive me! Oh, my brother, I am so sorry! So sorry! I never meant to hurt you! Why do I hurt so many creatures? Russell, please believe me, I didn't know what I was doing!" It was precisely at that moment that a light seemed to warm in the fox's eyes. Chanticleer looked and looked in them, wanting with all his heart to believe that his brother was looking back. "Are you there?" he whispered, and for an answer, oh dear God, the fox actually put up a thin paw and brushed the rooster's beak, just bumping the tip of it. "Well," said Chanticleer. He coughed. He cleared his throat violently. "Well!" He had an abundance of water suddenly inside his head, and he wanted to laugh, but laughter would squirt this water everywhere. "Well," he thundered, top of his lungs. "So, okay, tell you what, don't go away, because listen, I can chew for you, right? Right? I'll be right back." Gone was Chanticleer the rooster at high speeds, searching the hens, because where hens were there were seeds, and where seeds were there was dinner for his brother. He found them, the pillowy flock of hens, a-pecking in a little clearing. He blew them up with one roaring tackle, boom, and he took their place, his wings laid back, his head down, pecking, just like a chicken, stuffing seeds and corns and mushroom and fungus and sand into his crop until it swelled, until it bulged from his neck to the size of his bursting love for Russell. Now Pertolote stood watching him. When he charged back to the fox, she followed at a distance, and she was not smiling. But he was. Chanticleer was grinning like silly victory. Russell's eyes were glassy and unclosed. His body was limp. Yet the rooster grinned on him, announcing, "So we've turned the corner, right, brother? Give me a minute. Let my gizzard grind the grain. Ho, ho, and who needs teeth? Look at me. Never had a tooth in my head my whole life through. Ho, ho!" He took to pacing again, back and forth before the fox, grinning. But Pertolote caught his eye, and she was not smiling. Her eyes went down to the still, still fox. Chanticleer's eyes followed. Then she looked again upon her husband and gently shook her head. Chanticleer saw that, and his face collapsed. His whole expression changed. He glared at Pertolote. With his claw he began to beat his throat at the crop, slowly at first, and then with greater speed and greater impact. It should have hurt him. It should have burst that crop. He glared at Pertolote, scorching her. He hissed, "Don't you say it. Don't you name it, woman, and don't you judge me with your eye. I'll go to the end. The end!" He struck his crop with the knuckles of his claw. "And why? Because I could not!" He hissed with ruinous emotion. "Because I could not save my Mondo Cani!" The poor rooster raised his head, as though in dignity. The hen, however, dropped her eyes and gazed at the ground. No, she did not say it. Chanticleer, her husband, approached the fox with infinite gentleness. He crouched before his brother. He slipped his whole head and his neck, too, into Russell's mouth, down to the root of Russell's tongue, and there he brought forth the burden of his crop, meal made moist and wholesome, and there he left the offering. He withdrew, and then began to stroke the fox's throat in order to help his swallowing. Again and again, with unspeakable tenderness, he stroked Lord Russell, his claw like an ivory comb, his own eyes shut absolutely tight. Into the night he stroked. No, Pertolote did not say it. She watched these ministrations, and finally she wept, but she did not say that Russell the fox was dead. She suspected that Chanticleer already knew. Chapter 6. Preparations. There went up a cry in the middle of that night, a lingering scream, a calling, and a singular wail of rage. It did not arise to heaven. It went out across the sea like a lonely boat for battle. Worm! Lord Chanticleer the rooster stood alone on the shore of an endless sea. Behind him lay a dead land, flat and salted by the war that had been fought between the animals and the basilisks. Countless bodies had gone down upon those plains. Countless hearts had ruptured there, and throats had bellowed before they were torn. Now there was the wind only, and the pewter light of the moon, cold, shadowed as though in a vision, and still. A wall of earth humped in the moonlight, the piece of a wall, bent in an arc, the piece of a circle. It was naught but a ruin now, what once had been a round, closed battlement against Worm's forces. Once it had protected the animals, when built by the rooster's engineering, but it had suffered the monster's destruction. Now the wind took dust from its top, and the moonlight tombed it. Worm! Chanticleer was the single figure in all that landscape. He stood on the beach. Sea water hissed at his ankles. His head was up, and his neck was straining, and his eyes were blazing, rabid as though he could see for miles and miles, and down the curve of the horizon. Worm! He was calling as far as he could see. He was roaring with astounding power. Worm! The beakers themselves could not out-thunder him. Chanticleer shrieked with the freedom of hatred. Hatred was the force in him, and his cry was the lonely defiance of grief against infinities. "Worm!" across the water. "Worm!" And his body doubled with the fury, but he never shut his eye. "Worm!" To the farthest swell of the sea named Wormsmere, since Worm had caused it to be, by which he'd changed the face of the earth and weighted the planet. "Worm! I will kill you for what you have done to me!" But the water hissed at his ankles, and the moon made skull's eyes in the waves. Russell the fox was dead. Sweet Pertolote sang lauds that morning. Her song was so full of quiet communications that the animals woke up knowing, and no one needed to ask. A certain night had passed. A certain day had come. The night held death. The day demanded preparations. Poor Russell had finally. But Pertolote sang lauds. "Lady Hen," said Woden Stag. His brothers ranged behind him. "Where is the rooster?" Their faces were slack, their hearts racing. They were not far from panic. "He went to make arrangements," said Pertolote. "Will he come back again?" "He only went to get a grave," she said. She smiled at the simpleness of the mice, and then she saw that she shouldn't have. Their eyes went wounded, and they sucked their tiny lips. "He wasn't here," they pointed out, "when we woke up." "Aye, that's true," said Pertolote, and she tried to reason their troubles away. "But that's because he couldn't sleep all night." "Lady Hen, will he come back?" Pertolote gazed at him. "He's been gone before," she said, evidence of consolation. "He has always come back." Woden Stag said, "Uncle Russell is dead." And the eyes of all the mice agreed to that. "We want to cry for Uncle Russell, but we're scared, and we have to know, and we wish you would say it. Is the rooster coming back again?" "Ah, Woden Stag," murmured Pertolote, marveling at the wisdom of the mice. But all they wanted was simplicity. "Yes, cry, do cry. Cry and be sad for all of us, and never worry. Lord Chanticleer is certainly coming back. He hasn't left us. We're still together." The mice withdrew on tiny feet, mourning filling their eyes. Pertolote whispered, "So free to be honest, little tags. You are free to be sad as well." John Wesley Weasel, on the other hand, didn't drop a tear. He'd had his look at Russell before the dawn, after the rooster had slipped into the night. He'd had his talk with Russell. He'd had his say, though he couldn't allow as to how it had relieved him much, and of course he'd no idea what it did for Russell on account of Russell was dead. "John," said John, "he doesn't understand buggers what can't control themselves, no." This was how he talked to the fox, and how the weasel fashioned a farewell. It sounded mostly angry. "Gets good advices, yup. Perfectly clear commandings from the rooster, yup. Has a working brain atwixt his ears, yup. Can hear it saying, 'Shut up, Foxy, shut up!' Does he shut up? No!" John Wesley had a little head upon a long body. The more he talked to Russell's corpse, the louder he got, and the louder he got, the higher went that little head. He was outraged. "This bugger goes to working his mouth and can't stop, is killing him, and it won't stop, like as if John he should bash his own head against the stones and never stop, till chunks of his brains is sticking to his cheeks and never stop. Foxy!" hissed the weasel, furious. "Foxy ain't nobody's to blame for your dying but your own self. Oh, shame on you! And does you think John W. he'll give you some tears? Ho, 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 bugger! Not one! No, not one single tear from John's eye, no! Not for stupidities and dumbness, on account of if a foxy can kill him own self, well then a foxy gots to cry for him own self. There!" John Wesley Weasel made an end of his vigil respecting the fox. Before the dawn he marched away from that corpse with his head so high his forepaws barely touched the ground. He didn't cry, not with his head up there. He went about looking down on the world. All day long he lurked at the edge of the animals' activity, in the middle of which the fox lay, looking down on them. The hen and the mice washed Russell and combed his coat. They anointed his fur, with an oil pressed from the gland at the base of a hen's tail. So Russell took on a ruddy gloss, rich, red, and beautiful, and the sun struck copper from his shoulder. John Wesley looked down on all that. Some of the hens sat aside for the better part of the day, weaving with their beaks a pure white cloth of the down of their breasts, carefully, carefully. Others dipped their feathers in wormwood and brushed the fox's eyes and paws with the ointment. Its bitter odor touched the air, and by the air their souls. It loosened their tears until soundlessly they wept. John Wesley looked down on all that, down, so down that his neck ached and his forehead hurt from frowning. But he didn't cry, that weasel, no, not so much as one tear, and that was just fine, because the longer he didn't cry, the righter he was in his blame of the fox. There. Toward evening, a great black beetle felt his way across the dead land. He climbed the earthwork. In dust, he slid down the seaward side, and he moved on tweezer feet. Chanticleer, fixed in a brisk wind, still on the shore of Wormsmere, watched him come. The rooster's breast feathers seemed like a skirt swirling about him, snatched by breezes. His eye was narrow. His jet beak pointed in the direction of his looking. He stood as still as a post, waiting. The rooster and the beetle knew each other from disasters of the past, for the rooster had seen his 3 sons dead, and the beetle had buried them. Black Lazarus was a grave digger. Neither stood on ceremony. When Lazarus had struggled into earshot, Chanticleer threw wide a wing and pointed with a primary feather. "There," he said, indicating a spot as bleak as any other. "That's where the fox was bitten, sir. That's where we will bury him." The wind had thrown Wormsmere into a high fit of waves. The beetle maneuvered himself to assess the spot. He sat still. Chanticleer went and X'd it with a raking claw. "We'll have one hero in this place where we can memorialize him. One good reason for remembering." "We're near the sea," the beagle warned. His voice was as dark as his body, and as slow. "He fought near the sea," snapped Chanticleer. "Aye, but the water's a dreary grave, don't you know," said Lazarus. "It'll scour the hole from underneath, could cause a fearful stink of the bones, and maybe send them topside. Then keep the water out." The beetle, his whole head hidden in a hood, sat still, considering. "Well," he said, "could be a crypt could trick it." "Dig one." "Aye, dig one. 'Twould have to be in stone." "In stone, then. You can dig in stone?" "Aye. 'Tis my profession and my skill, digging in any sort of substance as presents itself. I can piece it for you, only—" Chanticleer jerked his impatience. "This is a dead land," he cried, suddenly down the wind. "Damnably crabbed and cold and dead. There can be nothing below but stone. Find your stone, Black Lazarus, and dig the fox's crypt, and keep your onlys for those confused by the thing you do." Without another glance for the beetle or for Wormsmere, Chanticleer returned the way he had come, a figure ignorant of the wind. He crossed the ruins of the earthwork. He passed the place where the coop once stood before the war, and he disappeared into the northern wood. And here was a shock the rooster did not notice. The wood was naked. All in a fortnight, the trees had lost their leaves to the ripping wind. Autumn is the killing season.